When my husband died, I thought the hardest part would be saying goodbye. I was wrong. The hardest part was looking up during his funeral and realizing my parents hadn't come. They weren't trapped in traffic. They weren't sick. They had skipped his funeral to celebrate my sister's luxury birthday party because, according to my mother, dead people don't know who shows up. I buried my husband without my own family beside me. Then, halfway through the eulogy, my phone began vibrating nonstop. 44 missed calls. One desperate message from my mother. Emma, please answer. Everything has fallen apart. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 36 years old, and until 3 days before the story began, I thought I understood what heartbreak felt like. I didn't. Nothing prepared me for standing beside my husband Daniel's hospital bed as the heart monitor fell silent after a sudden aneurysm stole him away. One ordinary Tuesday morning, he kissed my forehead before work. By sunset, I was signing paperwork no wife ever wants to see. Daniel wasn't just my husband. He was my best friend for 14 years. Calm when I panicked, patient when I doubted myself. The kind of man who remembered birthdays, shoveled elderly neighbors' driveways without being asked, and somehow made every room feel safer, simply by walking into it. Planning his funeral felt unreal. Friends from his engineering firm volunteered to help. Former military buddies flew in from different states. Our neighbors brought meals I barely touched. Everyone kept telling me I wasn't alone. Everyone except my own family. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. Unfortunately, it was also my younger sister Olivia's 32nd birthday celebration. Calling it a birthday party barely described it. She had rented an entire vineyard outside the city, hired a live band, a celebrity chef, and professional photographers. For weeks, my mother had talked about it like it was the social event of the year. Even then, I never imagined anyone would choose it over Daniel's funeral. The evening before the service, my phone rang. "Hi, sweetheart," my mother said gently. "Mom, are you and Dad coming by tomorrow morning before the funeral?" There was a brief silence. "Actually, we've been meaning to talk to you about that." Something inside me tightened. "Olivia's birthday reservation can't be changed," she continued. "Hundreds of people are attending. Everything's already paid for." I frowned. "I know that. The funeral is at 2. You can come to the service first." Another silence. Then she sighed. "Honey, Daniel's already gone." I stopped breathing. "What?" "We'll visit his grave next week. But Olivia only gets one birthday every year. We can't disappoint her guests." For several seconds, I couldn't find my voice. "Dad agrees with this?" "He does." My father finally came onto the speaker. "Emma, don't make your sister's special day about your grief." I stared at the wall. My husband was being buried. And somehow, I was the selfish one. "I understand," I whispered. Neither of them noticed how empty my voice sounded. The next afternoon, I stood beside Daniel's casket inside the quiet chapel. The front pew reserved for my parents remained completely empty. So did the seats marked for Olivia and the rest of my family. Meanwhile, every seat behind them was filled. Daniel's coworkers, his lifelong friends, neighbors, veterans who hadn't seen him in years. People who owed him nothing had traveled hundreds of miles just to say goodbye. As I stepped toward the podium to begin the eulogy, my phone vibrated silently inside my purse. I ignored it. Then it vibrated again. And again. By the time I finished speaking, there were 44 missed calls, all from my parents. For the first time that day, I wondered why the people who had skipped my husband's funeral suddenly couldn't stop begging for my attention. I didn't check my phone until the last guest had quietly left the cemetery. Daniel's closest friends stayed behind to help carry the flowers back to my car. One of his former army buddies gave me a long hug before saying, "He'd be proud of how strong you've been today." The words almost broke me. Once I was finally alone, I unlocked my phone. 44 missed calls. 12 voicemails. More than 20 text messages. Every single one came from my mother, my father, or Olivia. The final message simply read, "Emma, please answer. This is an emergency." I sat inside my car for almost a minute before pressing play on the first voicemail. My mother's voice sounded nothing like it had the night before. She was crying. Emma, please call us. Something terrible has happened. The second voicemail was from my father. His normally calm voice was shaking. Please don't ignore us. We need you, immediately. The third voicemail wasn't from either of them. It was from Michael Hansen, Daniel's attorney. My stomach tightened. Emma, he said professionally, I've been trying to reach you regarding Daniel's estate. Please call me as soon as you're available. I dialed his number first. He answered before the second ring. Mrs. Carter, I'm sorry for interrupting such a difficult day. It's all right. I went to your parents because I believed you were attending the reception afterward. Unfortunately, you had already left. I frowned. You went to my parents? Yes. They weren't at the funeral. There was a long pause. I know. His voice became noticeably colder. They were attending another event. I closed my eyes. I understand. Mrs. Carter, Daniel asked me to handle several matters immediately after his funeral. What kind of matters? 3 months ago, he updated his will. That surprised me. Daniel had mentioned reviewing paperwork, but never discussed the details. Michael continued. He created a charitable foundation in memory of his late father. He also transferred ownership of his consulting company entirely into your name. I stared through the windshield. Daniel had never said a word. There are also several community scholarship programs he personally funded. He wanted the announcements made after today's service. My eyes filled again. Even after his death, Daniel had been thinking about helping other people. Michael hesitated before speaking again. Unfortunately, your parents attempted to involve themselves. What do you mean? They assumed they would help make decisions regarding Daniel's business assets. I almost laughed. They have nothing to do with his company. I explained that. What happened? They became argumentative. Apparently, when Michael calmly explained that Daniel had legally placed every responsibility in my hands, Olivia interrupted the conversation. According to several witnesses, she complained that discussing legal paperwork was ruining her birthday atmosphere. Michael packed his briefcase and prepared to leave. Before he reached the exit, several respected local business owners who had known Daniel approached him. They had overheard enough. One quietly asked why Daniel's own in-laws hadn't attended his funeral. Michael simply answered truthfully. They chose another celebration. The room reportedly fell silent. Within minutes, 2 business partnerships my father had been negotiating quietly disappeared. A charitable fundraiser my mother organized lost its largest sponsor. People weren't punishing them. They were simply deciding who they trusted. As I ended the call, another message appeared from my mother. Emma, please. They'll only listen to you. For the first time since Daniel died, I realized my parents weren't calling because they missed me. They were calling because the consequences of their own choices had finally arrived. I didn't answer my mother's calls that night. Instead, I drove home to the quiet house Daniel and I had shared for 14 years. His jacket still hung beside the front door. His coffee mug was still in the sink. His reading glasses rested on the end table exactly where he'd left them 3 days earlier. For the first time since losing him, I sat in complete silence. Not because the pain had disappeared, because I finally understood something Daniel had always tried to teach me. You can't control other people's choices, only your response to them. The following Monday, Daniel's attorney, Michael Hansen, called again. Emma, he said, we're holding the formal estate meeting tomorrow morning. There are several documents Daniel wanted completed immediately after his funeral. I'll be there. When I arrived at the law office the next day, I immediately noticed my parents sitting together in the conference room. Neither of them smiled. Olivia looked nothing like the glamorous birthday photos she'd posted only days earlier. The confidence she always carried had vanished. My mother stood as soon as she saw me. Emma, thank goodness you're here. I simply nodded and took a seat across the table. Michael entered carrying several folders. Thank you, everyone. He began reading Daniel's final instructions. Everything had been planned carefully months before his passing. His consulting company would remain exactly as it was, with me becoming the sole owner. His investment accounts would continue funding engineering scholarships for first-generation college students. A portion of his savings would permanently support the Veterans Rehabilitation Center, where he'd volunteered every Christmas. Another donation would establish a memorial fund at the children's hospital that had once saved his little cousin's life. Listening to each decision reminded me exactly who Daniel had been. Even knowing life was unpredictable, he had spent his final months planning ways to help people he'd never even meet. When Michael finished, he closed the folder. "Mrs. Carter, Daniel also left you a personal letter." He handed me a sealed envelope. I slipped it into my purse. I wasn't ready to read his final words in front of everyone. My father finally cleared his throat. "Emma, before you leave." I looked at him. "We need your help." I stayed silent. He continued carefully. "Those business partners Richard introduced me to, they've all walked away." My mother quickly added, "The charity board removed me as chairwoman yesterday." Olivia looked down at the table. "My employer found those social media posts for my birthday." She swallowed hard. "They asked why our whole family skipped a funeral." Another silence filled the room. Finally, my mother whispered, "Can you speak to them?" They all respected Daniel. "They'll listen if you explain." For several seconds, nobody moved. Then I quietly asked, "What exactly would I explain?" No one answered. "That you skipped your son-in-law's funeral because a vineyard party sounded more enjoyable? That while I was burying my husband, you were smiling for photographers?" Tears filled my mother's eyes. "We made a terrible mistake." I gently shook my head. "No. A mistake is forgetting an appointment. A mistake is sending flowers to the wrong address. You didn't make a mistake. You made a decision." I looked at each of them. "You knew exactly where I would be. You knew exactly what that day meant, and you chose something else." My father lowered his head. "We never imagined people would judge us so harshly." "They didn't judge you," I replied calmly. "They simply believed what your actions showed them." Michael quietly slid the final documents across the table. I signed every page exactly as Daniel had requested. Then I stood. As I reached the doorway, my mother softly called my name. "Emma, do you think you'll ever forgive us?" I paused before answering. "I already have." She looked relieved. Then I finished. "But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. And it doesn't rebuild trust." Months later, I found purpose volunteering at the Veterans Center Daniel loved so deeply. The grief never completely disappeared. But every life I helped reminded me that love leaves something stronger than memories. It leaves character. And in the end, the phone call that ruined my parents wasn't made by fate. It was made the moment they chose a birthday party over standing beside their daughter as she said goodbye to the man who had loved them like his own family.